Welcome to Kubernetes SIG Apps for February 4th, 2019. I just shared the meeting minutes into chat. And so for February 4th, hi, my name is Matt Farina. I'll be chairing today. And Adnan's here as well. He's one of the other co-chairs of SIG Apps. So you got two of the three of us today. For the announcements, there's one that I added, a feature freeze. So feature freeze for the next release was supposed to... Oh, Ken, you're there. Fantastic. Feature freeze was supposed to be last Friday, and for realsies, it's today. So this is just a reminder that we are in feature freeze right now, which basically means that whatever you have needs to be implementable, if you're thinking in cat forms, at this stage of the game, if it's going into the next release. If you've got any questions about that, please feel free to ask, but we're at feature freeze. And then with that, we are up for our demo. Do we have somebody on to demo this today? We have Namespace Configuration Controller.
Yeah, Rafael is here.
Hello. Well, the floor is yours. You can go ahead and share your screen. You can start talking. It's all yours.
Okay, thank you. Let me see. Trying to share my desktop. Can you see it?
Good morning, guys.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I wanted to share with you an idea that I've implemented a few months ago. I am a consultant, so I do consulting for OpenShift, which is just the Red Hat distribution for Kubernetes. And very often I find myself in conversation with my customers where they are not comfortable giving ownership of some of the namespace objects to the end developers. Okay, so and for example, I'm talking about network policies, quotas, limit ranges, and this type of object that are a little bit on the borderline between normal workload type of workload objects that developers normally define, and more, administrative and configuration type of objects. And so given that problem, and given that some customers, large enterprise financial institution, they don't want to give control over, for example, firewall rules, like which are network policies in OpenShift, or quotas or limit range to the developer, we often end up in creating provisioning workflow, or sometimes we call them onboarding processes, where these objects are defined when the namespace is first created and handed over to the developer team. And this is fine, but it's a little bit rigid, and it's also the enforcement point is just at creation time, and there's never an easy way to check that the configuration is maintained in the future. So my idea is just to solve this problem was to create a controller or an operator to enforce configurations inside namespaces. And by configuration, I mean this type of objects that are a little bit borderline. And inside namespaces, so that because of the operator control loop, this configuration are constantly enforced, and then it's also easy to compose multiple configurations inside the same namespace. So because the controller, and I can go to the next slide, because the controller basically looks at the CRD of the namespace configuration, and looks at the namespace selector to decide where to apply this configuration. I can create multiple configurations that will end up on the same namespace, and therefore I can easily compose or give ownership of these or different pieces of the configuration to different administrators. And so the way this works is we have this controller that watches for namespace configurations, CRDs, and then when the namespace configuration selects a namespace, it will create some of the objects. And then obviously the idea is that, sorry, this shouldn't be cluster admin, this should be dev. And then the idea is the developers can go and create their normal objects, and they won't have access to change the objects that were created by the configuration controller. Questions so far? This 11 idea. So more in detail, the design is that we have a cluster level CRDs that define namespace configurations with a set of configurations to be applied and the namespace selector. And the intention here means the intent here is that those configurations will be applied to all the namespace that are selected. And then the namespace controller itself is an operator that watches for new namespaces, and as they are created, it applies the configuration to them and watches for new namespace configurations, and as they are created, it will apply those configurations to the namespace that are selected again by the namespace selector. So what can one do with this type of controller? For example, sorry, probably can't see this. Let me see if I can make it larger. For example, here I have a configuration that will enforce a quota on the selected namespaces. Okay, so this is a small quota, and so every time a namespace has the label size small, this object will be created in that namespace. Okay, so now my provisioning, what I call the provisioning workflow, the onboarding process, it's simplified because I just need to be able to set labels on the namespaces that are created, and then the policies or this configuration will be applied driven by those labels. And I have another example here. For example, this is a network policy type of configuration. In a multi-tenant environment, by default, we want all the projects to be isolated from one another. This is the assumption here. And so this will, on the projects that are labeled multi-tenant, this will create network policies such that traffic is allowed only internal to the namespace and from the namespace called default, because that's the way it works today in OpenShift. So these are two examples that I had here. I can show them from the command line if you guys think it's useful, but I think that this should give you an idea of how this works. Any comments?
I actually had a similar situation. I'm helping a customer with an OpenShift environment, and we also had a similar use case as this. So we wanted our tenants to be able to provision projects themselves as well. So it looks like in your process flow on 3, you're still having cluster admins create these projects or namespaces for tenants and labeling them appropriately to be listened to by your controller. Is that the process flow currently for you?
No, when I say an onboarding process, it's usually self-service type of onboarding process where they have a UI, dev teams have a UI, and they fill up some questions, and then based on that there is something triggers and a new namespace is created and handed over to them. So yeah, so I'm not sure if it's similar to what you were saying, but they don't have usually developers don't have the ability to directly create namespaces unless it's really a sandbox type of cluster.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have our permissions split up by LDAP group so that admins, tenant admins, we call them, have the ability to provision projects and then allocate cluster resource quotas to sub-projects within that tenant environment. But we wanted to make sure that all these tenant projects are created with a standard configuration, network isolation, as you talked about, default role bindings for users coming in so that when new projects are created, developers automatically have edit capabilities, similar processes like this specific to the tenant, and then let them have permission to add additional, LDAP groups to default role bindings as they provision items, rather than having it be at a cluster level. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It sounds to me you have an intermediary level of permission between the administrator that can do everything and the final developers.
Yeah, because, I'm kind of running as the sysadmin-ish on that current effort, and I don't want to be in the process of creating projects and permissions at a global scale. I'd rather delegate that responsibility to the tenant admins.
Right.
How do you like that differentiation between keeping it from the cluster admin side and letting them dictate what are network, what do you call them? Sorry, namespace configurations that are available and how they're applied to projects, versus delegating that to allow certain sets of those to be configured by the tenant admin, i.e. joining project net namespaces together?
Yeah, I think that's fine if you have that level of delegation. I think overall also this tenant admin, they could use an automation like the one I am presenting. They would just do this they would just create configurations that only select their own namespaces that they're controlling. But eventually, I think the value here is that these configurations are not just created and set at the beginning when the namespace is initially created, but there is a controller that continually enforces them. So, for example, let's go back to the example here of the quota. Let's say that we decide altogether that the small size quota now shouldn't just be 4 CPU and 2 gigabytes, but it becomes 8 CPU and 8 gigabytes. I can just come here and change this object and reapply it, and it will be automatically applied to all the projects that were under that configuration. So this level of automation, I found it to be difficult to achieve when you have these policies set up only at the provisioning time, and then everything else becomes manual. So this is regardless of whether you have the cluster admin doing the provisioning or you have these intermediary tenant admins that do the provisioning.
Awesome, thank you. And the last question I have you thought about multi-cluster monitoring? We don't like to have to propagate these, configurations amongst multiple clusters. And we like one central place to control cluster resource quotas and monitor cluster resource usage. Are you looking to get this to be a multi-cluster monitoring tool or configuration tool, or is it focused on just a single one cluster?
So this is a very interesting question. Now, when I was thinking about this problem, I was thinking about one cluster at a time. But I've been recently working on also on federation, right, and the idea of multi-clusters. And with federation, you could propagate CRDs relatively easily. So you could propagate these policies if you wanted to do that. I just haven't explored this option.
Thank you.
Another thought would be you could actually, so if you have multiple clusters and you use some type of a GetOps workflow to point to CRDs in particular repositories, maybe the same CRD if you're looking for a uniform configuration across clusters or otherwise, you should be able to actually achieve that today, right? Like you could have one custom, as long as the controller is installed across many clusters, if you have one resource that describes the default behavior for configuring a namespace globally across all of your infrastructure, there are ways to apply that to many clusters outside of the scope of actually doing it inside of Kubernetes itself that would provide you with a uniform, repeatable behavior.
Agreed. My last thought is I started this with a predefined set of types that I was going to support, which are listed here, because these were the ones that most of the time come up in those discussions with the customers. But then when I was implementing the code, I realized I was writing the same piece of code for 6-7 times for each of those types. So I was wondering, is there a better way to do like generic operation on object on API objects? So it turns out there is this unstructured API that would allow to refactor the code, one thing, but not only that, it would allow to just make this controller much more generic and able to support any object to become part of this this namespace configuration.
Yeah, we generally use the unstructured client for cases when you don't know the objects you are dealing with.
Yeah. So that's a possibility of improvement, and if anyone wants to work on that, the patches are welcome. Yeah, that.
So this controller has to effectively run as a cluster administrator, though, right?
It has definitely elevated permission. I don't think I gave it cluster administrator, but yes, it has a lot of permissions.
So it can not only create, but it can create and remove role bindings and cluster role bindings, right? So it's capable of granting permissions to other users.
Yeah, I actually didn't give those permissions by default. So if you want to be able to do those type of things, you have to add those permissions to the service account running the controller. Because I thought that was too much by default. So depending on if you're using role binding and cluster role binding objects, depending on what you're trying to do, you would have to have those permissions. Yeah.
But configuring RBAC is probably one of the most challenging things that users have to do on a per namespace basis at provisioning time when they're turning up a new namespace and granting via delegation or otherwise capabilities to other users or teams to be able to use it. So I get why. But now if you were going to, so like I can wrap my head around the set of permissions that this controller would need based on the set of objects that you want to deal with, and you can configure it to have the right RBAC permissions to be able to do that. If you made it unstructured and work on a generic type, how would we manage configuring RBAC appropriately to give the controller the permissions it needs to modify the objects it's configured to create? Or would you have to just grant kind of broad star permissions across the entire cluster? That would be my main concern with doing something that's any type.
No, it's a good point. And I haven't thought in depth about it, but I think in that case, we would give very, very limited permissions by default to this controller. And then depending on the policy you want to create, you would also have to add permissions to that service account too. to manipulate those API objects. At least this is a possibility.
Yeah, it's a possibility. The trade-off is, though, that makes it harder to configure the controller itself. I'm not looking for a right answer. I was just wondering if you guys had thought it through. Cool.
Okay. That's all I have. There are a few links here. Maybe I can add this. I'm not sure if there is a place where I can upload this presentation. But there is a blog post that explains this in details, and obviously the Git repo.
Yes, actually, could you link this presentation into the agenda for today? I see that you linked a blog post in, but you've got some useful things in here, such as a link to the Git repo or blog post.
Right.
Or the Git repo, you've already linked a blog post. You could either put this presentation in, or if you just want to also link the Git repo in so people can find it, whatever you want, please feel free to add it to the notes from today.
Okay, I'll see. It's not reachable from outside. That's a problem. So I will have to print it, create a PDF and upload it somewhere.
Okay. If you wanted to take some of the information like the Git repo and that and add it to the agenda just as an easy way, that would be a good way to start.
Okay. I'll do that right away.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. The next topic we have up today is the SIG Apps sessions at KubeCon EU. Adnan, are you on? You there?
Yeah.
Since you know more about this, in particular the different options, could you spill them out?
Yeah, sure. So there's going to be two different options that we have at KubeCon EU. We can either have the same as last time, which was an intro session, which I think is about 25 minutes, and then, or 35 minutes maybe, and then also a 35-minute deep dive session. Or we can put them together and have a single session that's 80 minutes long. So the single session would be the deep dive, and we'd probably have kind of like a meet and greet and just kind of open discussion about various different topics. So yeah, kind of just asking the floor here, what would people prefer? Especially those who are going to be at KubeCon EU and have been to previous KubeCons. What format do they kind of like the best? And so I can give my personal take, which is that I think that in the past, when we've had the longer sessions, they've been more useful, and we're able to kind of have just a longer time to discuss different topics, and people can kind of go into different groups and discuss different things. Also provides a good kind of time to meet and greet. So I personally prefer those sessions, but I'm interested to hear if anyone finds the intro sessions useful.
My suggestion would be one longer session. Just looking at the last times we've done this, and even the way the venue lays it out and displays things, I hope it's better than Seattle was last time, because so many of those sessions were in the other building. But I would look at maybe one big in-depth session that could talk about whatever needed to be talked about instead of breaking it up. I think that went pretty well if we go back a couple of years, and maybe even better than this last time.
Yeah, agreed.
I kind of agreed. Well, my experience has been this: when we do the intro and the deep dive is separate things. You do definitely get two different audiences for the intro and the deep dive, but we get more time than we actually probably need for the intro, and not enough time for the deep dive. But the deep dive always runs long, and well, the deep dive always ends before everything is finished, I guess you'd say. We usually need more time for it, and the intro, basically, we don't usually need as much time for the intro as we usually get. Putting them together gives us a better mix and the ability to kind of mix better. The downside is that you'll probably get the people who come to the intro will probably come to the deep dive as well, and they may not be as interested in participating in the deep dive.
That's a fair point. Yeah, if there's something that we can do to make sure that newcomers to the SIG are also well represented in a deep dive, that would also be good.
I think maybe open it up to the mailing list and see if we get.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good idea. So we have until Friday to make a decision. So I'll go out on a mailing list.
All right. And it sounds like all the chairs are kind of leaning toward, let's go with the join session. So default if no opposition.
Sounds good.
And since I think you were already planning on being there, did you want to take the reins of sending the mail to the list and wrangling, submitting it and everything and talking with us about it? Can you go on that?
I can go ahead and do that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks.
All right. The next topic that we have up here today is the CNCF SIGs. Yes, the CNCF, the parent organization of Kubernetes and Prometheus and Helm and Linkerd and gRPC and all of these things. The TOC is looking to introduce special interest groups. And so nobody was surprised and everyone sees how things relate. I thought it would be a good idea to kind of talk about some of that here. So I'll go ahead and share that document. Just a moment. Here we go. Please let me know when you can see my screen.
We can see it.
All right. So this is the final draft of the document that's in work that describes the SIGs. It has been worked on over a period of, well, as you can see, several months to try to figure out the purpose of this. And right at the top it says it is to scale the contributions to the CNCF. And quite frankly, the TOC has a lot of responsibility. That's the Technical Oversight Committee of the CNCF. They have a lot of responsibility, from identifying new projects that need to come in to looking at just cloud native and all of this. And they're all very, very busy people. And so they've been trying to figure out how do you get working groups and groups of people around particular topics. And so far they've had 4. For example, there's been a CI working group. There has been a serverless working group that created cloud events as a spec from it, which is one of the CNCF projects. And how do you do that? And the organization around the original working groups was very loose. And so they said, how do we create working groups version 2? And that kind of morphed into SIGs, special interest groups, modeled a little bit on Kubernetes, except the one big important caveat. These SIGs have no authority over any of the projects themselves. Okay. So I'll walk through this real quick. If it's not LinkedIn, is it LinkedIn? Here, let me drop the link in. I think everybody can get to this. Here's the link to that document. And so basically the objective is to strengthen the ecosystem, identify gaps in the CNCF portfolio, like what should be worked on next. Where are there holes in cloud native that there's nothing there for, that the CNCF doesn't have and maybe nobody even has. Educate and inform users. That's a big thing right now is how do we get good information out there to different kinds of end users? You know, clarify relationships between projects. There's a whole lot of, I'll get into some of this stuff real quick. I'll look at the responsibilities here. So the SIG responsibilities, this is an easy way to see it, is to basically look at the high level roadmap of what's going on in their space, right? So if you're talking about lower infrastructure, like where something like Rocket and Containerd and those things fit, what's just going on in that space? In general, what's happening, what are projects doing, both for CNCF and non-CNCF projects. This is also to inform the TOC, to have expert decisions, things like that. Perform project discovery and outreach on any candidate projects, and then help those projects when they present to the TOC. And of course, one of the big things here is actually perform health checks on CNCF projects. For some things like Kubernetes, that's not a real big deal, For some of the other CNCF projects, actually finding the health of those and getting information on those and maybe looking at where they're struggling to help reinvigorate them is an actual concern. But this is kind of their scope when it comes to the projects. Then they get into end user communication, which is outbound. How do you educate end users on what's going on here? And you see things like presentations and white papers. Some of the stuff is very similar to what we've done here in SIG Apps over time. But it's all about how do you go out to the world and share the value proposition, the processes, the tools, things like that to help people understand. And a lot of this is if you look at the technology adoption lifecycle, Kubernetes is still very early on, especially when you look at enterprises. And a lot of what we know here and what we know around Kubernetes space and things like that is tribal knowledge. It's not written down and communicated well enough yet. And so if we want to onboard more people, that's the idea of educate out. Then there's the whole idea of inbound communication, which is gather all of this information we've talked about and look at sharing it up and sharing it out to some of the projects. Like how do you get case studies, pain points, details from end users, and then share those with the particular projects, whether it's Kubernetes or Linkerd or just different projects to say, hey, how do you share these things out? And there's actually some other things going on now with the end user group, which is another part of the CNCF of people who don't produce services or products, but just consume all this stuff. Where we're going to be able to tie into those through the CNCF, and then how do you share this around? But it's stuff like this, and there's community enablement, all the good words, and then just kind of run those meetings and have those responsibilities. This is kind of the scope of it, which is similar to ours. And they've got the operating model here, which is loosely based on what Kubernetes does. They've got chairs, tech leads, things like that, elections, governance, all the fun stuff, right? But where it gets interesting, and I just scrolled to it, is if you look at the first group of 6 SIGs that they're suggesting. This started off as far more than 10, and they said, how do we collapse this down and get smaller and smaller and smaller to something they can start with? You'll actually see one that's app dev, ops, and testing. It's very similar to what we have here, and it has things like telepresence we've had demoed here, build packs. I don't know that we've talked much about cloud events. In the past, we've talked a ridiculous amount about Helm. CNCF CI, if you're not familiar with this, CNCF CI actually looks at, if it'll load, how things are running in different CI systems. And by the way, this is not widely shared yet. It's the cross-cloud CI project, but they're trying to get CI running in all of these different environments for many of the projects that need it or want it. And a lot of when you see things failure, it's just a failure to get things up and running smoothly right now. It's not saying the project's failing or the infrastructure is failing or things don't work. It's more complex than that, and getting a particular testing environment running everywhere just isn't easy. And that's what that group does. But that is also one of those things that they're talking about being in there. Although that may be, since it's more infrastructure-y, something that needs to live elsewhere, but this is all tentative. And so they're looking at, here's the projects that it would be looking at the health of and overseeing in just that kind of space. This is all tentative, probably to be discussed at the next meeting, which I think is tomorrow. To maybe finalize and get that going. And so this is one of those things where we'll probably want to look at Kubernetes SIG Apps and CNCF SIG App Dev Ops and Testing and see where there's an overlap and see how we move forward with that. Does anyone have any thoughts? I didn't share everything in here. I know most of what's in this document. Anybody have any questions or thoughts on this?
I'm not exactly sure what these SIGs are empowered to do or what they're supposed to be doing. Who they report up to, like where these reports flow to, like very much of what this is unclear to me.
Okay, perfect. So they report up to the TOC. They are a support group for the TOC. All their authority, anything that they do is based within the TOC's realm. Right, and they will not be making decisions on projects, whether it's new projects coming in or anything, but they may provide guidance and expert guidance to people on the TOC, and the TOC may use it, reject it, do what they want with it. It's really, the TOC is the body in this place. As far as the things that they produced, a lot of it is to provide for education and things like that, and reference architectures, stuff like that. Like one of the things that's been talked about a lot, and I'm not sure where governance is where it fell in, was some of the security stuff. How do you do good security practices for dealing with things like in your cluster, who gets access to what? And then what kind of practices are people doing, and how do you communicate that so people are coming on board can see what's going on, right? That's user, that's access management, how to use RBAC well, stuff like that. That's one of the things that's been discussed. In fact, there's been a proposed CNCF working group for a while that's been just meeting and doing this, and they're looking at the kinds of materials and education and things like that that they want to share out to the world, just to say, here are good practices based on things people are doing. And so there's another education aspect to that of how do we start educating people to onboard more people to cloud native, because that's a real problem right now, education. And not just how to use tools, but the concepts behind it. Does that help?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, I sort of get the vision for what this is, I guess. I hope that it's useful.
I hope so too. For a certain class of folks, I expect it will be useful. Yeah.
But again, they still don't get like, so they look like they have the same delineation in terms of like SIG chairs and tech leads. I don't understand what the tech leads would be doing if by default they don't own any code. Like it doesn't, like there's a lot of things I just look at, I'm like, this is a little crazy. The other thing I kind of take exception with is the notion that having people from different companies promotes any form of thought diversity or whatever. Like if you're going to put something in about diversity and the criteria is your employer, I feel that's kind of like, I don't know, not a good way to go about approaching that particular subject. You might want to use different phrasing. I don't know.
No, these are wonderful questions. So the tech lead one is one that I also poked at, because I said, why? You don't own a technical thing in any particular area. Why? What's the purpose of the tech lead? And really, the whole idea was the role of a tech lead requires a different set of skills from chairs, and sometimes you have people who do both. Sometimes it's different. Chairs kind of have to wrangle people, deal with action items and organizational things, and there's lots of people like this at the TOC and CNCF level who are willing to wrangle things. They're expert meeting wranglers, right? But then they need technical people who, I don't think a lead is the right word because they're not leading the technology, but they are experts in it who can be pulled in and do reviews and say, I'm willing to guarantee time to look at these projects. I can talk in depth on the technologies and the reasons and the patterns and all of that stuff. And there's places where people with that expertise are known, and they want them to be able to say, I will regularly commit to showing up and doing these technical reviews of things. And that's where the tech lead comes in. I don't think lead is really, because you're not actually leading anything, but that's the name that they've chosen. This was one that I still think, I don't know. Right, I had the same questions, and I pushed back, but I acquiesced. But that's where they're looking for, because they're not actually going to lead anything other than being a technology expert who's willing to show up and give their 2 cents when they want it on this stuff. The other is with diversity. The CNCF, the way that they tend to view things is very organization centric, because they have paying members both on the vendor side, which is who you see with the members, and even with the way they look at the end user community. There's a specific end user community, and those are all people from different companies. In fact, if you go look at the CNCF website and you go to people, you will see the end user community. And this isn't just any end user, although I'll argue you should look at all the end users. These are actually companies that pay to be part of the end user community of Kubernetes and support the CNCF. So the CNCF is just organized in a very company or organization who pays them manner. And so that just kind of filters through to everything that's going on. There is also the idea that Different companies just do different processes. They do things different ways. And whether there's a right process or a wrong process or many right processes or many wrong processes is something that people at all these companies love to argue. And one of the things that they want to foster out of this is that one company's or organization's way of doing things doesn't overly dominate what they say can or should be done, to let many companies who've done many different processes have the ability to have those incorporated in it, and then let other people make the call on what's right for them. That's kind of a philosophy here of not letting somebody dominate on the way to do things when there's actually a bunch of people who think there's a bunch of different ways. And because they're organized around company unit, that's kind of how they want to ensure that diversity of that. If that helps provide the background for it.
Could I interject?
Please.
Ah, thanks. I agree with Ken's comment, but I think maybe in a different context. I think just the terminology, it seems like an unfortunate, like it's fine if they have a focus of what you just described, but defining that as diversity might be confusing to some people. And I am one of those people. It seems to think that the wording's wrong.
I would say that if we want to have reasonable discussions about diversity in the CNCF or the Kubernetes community, and you frame those around employer, that really throws out any legitimacy to having a discussion about diversity based on the modern understanding of what diversity in the workplace means. So I would definitely phrase that differently and like kind of seek to communicate that we want to not have a dominance of any one company, as opposed to doing it the other way.
So let me suggest this, okay? I was involved in the writing of this document in certain sections of it. Now, there were a whole lot of people involved in writing this. And so along the process, I actually pushed back and gave my 2 cents, such as you question the terminology tech lead. I did that as well. Now, you see how far my 2 cents went with it because they have it anyway. So my suggestion would be is to either come to the CNCF meeting or jump on the TOC mailing list or give feedback in that capacity. While I would love to carry it, the things that have come up here are things that I know that I can't carry and have influence in. But if more voices were to come along from different people and suggest these things, then there might be that ability. But I can't actually carry these particular issues just because I know the background, me and the interactions that I've had so far, the people who've been involved, things like that. They need to hear it from others.
Yeah.
And so there's a CNCF TOC meeting. I want to say it's tomorrow at 8 a.m. Pacific time.
Could we, I agree with the things you said, Matt, and like, instead of having like us individually try and come, like it might make sense. I think there's other people who feel this way as well. And just like, we could get a group of people together that all show up together at the same time and say, yes, this is like, we all feel this way. It might, do you think that would have more of the impact?
Maybe. Maybe. The other thing that I would suggest is the person who wrangled taking mad pages of notes and comments and just went through the whole thing and curated all the thoughts from all the people into this list and then walked through cleaning it up was Quentin. Now, you all know Quentin. So I would also suggest maybe tying off with him on this because Alexis has been very, very busy lately and he's the one who started this. But Quentin has had room to carry this kind of to the completion. And so that ability to have squish and influence in that is all going through him. So if you have a time between now and tomorrow, I would suggest maybe trying to tie off with him on it as well and see what he thinks.
Okay, and how like set in stone is this? Is there like a closing window because like maybe not all of us have the bandwidth to do that today. And if it's like, if there's like a month, maybe we have more time to get our ducks in order.
We don't have a month.
We don't have a month. Okay.
We don't have a month. So let me check real quick. So by the way, since the last TOC meeting, which was several weeks ago now, like 3 weeks ago, there's been 2 weeks in between, is when all this curation happened, was between those meetings based on this stuff. There have been other ongoing meetings. The last meeting where all of this really happened and really got cleaned up and got showcased was last Tuesday. So this is actually the first SIG Apps meeting since this happened. I think they're moving Alexis is moving to get it quickly. Sorry, I'm looking for the TOC agenda to see if it's on the meeting minutes for tomorrow. But I think they wanted to get it moving very quickly, but I'm also not sure how the meeting is going to go, because they also wanted this to be a handoff between the old projects, or the old TOC and the new TOC, and I'm not sure how the timing is going to end up working. It is on, so the agenda is a graduation announcement, the election and everything to do with the election, and they're electing a new chair and everything to do with that. Okay, so they're electing a new chair and going through that process, and they're going to talk about that. And then there is this CNCF SIGs, and that's the three things on the agenda for tomorrow. So I don't know that there is much time.
Okay, thank you for that context. It's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
And did you have anything else to say?
That's all I had on this particular one. Okay. I'll stop sharing. Then the last thing that I had on here, and again, I added this one, and it actually came out of the Helm discussion, was the CRD version lifecycle management workflows. In Helm, we've been talking about how do we manage CRDs, and we've had some interesting cases come up. For example, Cert Manager will say, we have a version. We'll just say V1 Alpha 1, and we want to go, after this has been deployed in a cluster, update it and change descriptions or change validations on the same version, right? They're going to change some of those things, which becomes, of course, interesting problems when you're dealing with management in different ways, because CRDs are cluster-wide, right? So if you deploy something in, and maybe you've got two namespaces, two people doing two different things, and now you want to update that, and one person from one side wants to update that, that impacts somebody else's stuff running in the same cluster. It kind of gets into this whole, how do you manage, not just install, but then manage versions and things like that? What kind of patterns need to happen? Interesting timing is this is come up in the SIG architecture. It looks like this was one of the topics that we were hoping to talk about last week. And there's a doc with a proposal, although I don't have access to this doc yet because it's not public. I've requested access. Oh, there, sorry, I got access while we were chatting here. And so, how do we go about doing that? And before we want to do anything in Helm, and I'm sure any other tool does, we should probably figure out, how do we manage CRDs inside of Kubernetes? What's like the right way to do that? Install, upgrades, deletions, basically your CRUD operations when it affects multiple things across the cluster. And so we wanted to have a conversation or start that about, what do we do? Where do we go?
Right now, you do not delete CRDs unless you want to make all of the resources that are defined by that definition suddenly disappear and break everything in your cluster. So deletion is not really an option right now. Now is a great time for people who are interested to get involved in the conversation around CRD versioning and CRD conversions. I'm pretty sure the current implementation still utilizes mutating webhooks in order to implement the conversions for the CRD on the API server side. We can talk about, I guess, what the envisioned workflow for that is. But again, if this is something that you have opinions about, now would be a great time to go voice them more broadly to API machinery in particular.
Also, if you're interested, the project, the SDK subproject of API Machinery is thinking about how to provide machinery to implement that stuff in a way that's a little simpler than doing it by hand at a low level.
So maybe one of the use cases that we have, at least on Helm, to bring a practical real world use case into this, is what about updating CRDs in place? So basically you have V1 Alpha 1 and you want to update the definition for V1 Alpha 1 that's already in a cluster. What are the thoughts on this?
There's no safe way to do that. No, the answer is not that. There are things you could do. You could update the resource definition in a way that does something like add a field, But if you remove a field, I think adding fields works. I think maybe, yeah, that's adding fields would be a safe thing to do. Potentially changing validation in a way that doesn't invalidate prior objects, but would only invalidate things that don't yet exist would be safe to do. The way it would work in practice is you'd have to implement a resource definition at a new group version and install that and then do a conversion to that, having separate validation for that new group version, which I think is all still, I'm not sure if that hit beta yet.
Those
again,
are the same API semantics as the built-in types.
Yeah, it is. It is effectively the same. We took the same things that were challenging about built-in types, and we couldn't get out of them when we started doing custom versions. So there are ways to do an update. Like prescriptively, I would say the only safe thing to do is, again, to create a new group version where the semantics are changed, and then implement a converting webhook that goes between the two. But remember, just like within built-in types, there is a rule that has to be strict. There has to be strict backward compatibility between the two versions.
You have to be able to round trip both directions.
Yes.
Yeah. There's like a cheaper way of doing some of this stuff, which is like how protocol buffer backwards compatibility support works, which is if you want to change the semantics of like, or if you want to like change how a field is represented, for instance, that you just add a second copy of that field with the new representation and just leave the old one in forever and basically say it's deprecated. It's ugly. It ends up with like an API that has a lot of old stuff that's deprecated, but it's pretty trivial to support if you're desperate.
Again, these rough edge use cases, providing feedback now, particularly from what the challenges using Helm in order to do things like update or potentially install two Helm charts that have different versions of the same CRD, or installing a Helm chart that depends on another Helm chart where you have basically, say you install two Helm charts that both depend on different versions of the same CRD, like what that looks like. If you do it in the same, like there are a lot of challenges that package management with custom resource definitions would pose.
And it's not just Helm, it's any of the tools that are out there and flows out there, because you may have two people who don't even know about each other doing things in two separate namespaces, and maybe they're just even deploying their own entirely raw resources in there. And you know, maybe they're both installing raw cert manager or trying to leverage it and having to deal with this. It just ends up becoming very, very difficult with API versions.
It's super difficult. So one of the other conversation that's kind of going on right now is, do we need some notion of like namespace resource definitions? So you have to remember the concept of a custom resource definition is, I'm going to teach the API machinery to talk about a new resource. And implicit in that is sort of like the person who's modifying what the API machinery is capable of processing is a cluster administrator. That doesn't work well for everybody's organization. In particular, if your model of tenancy revolves around namespaces and you have many teams who are acting kind of in an administrative way inside of a namespace, right? And then you have this notion of a resource definition, which is only cluster scope. And to be clear, there's no definition of a namespace custom resource definition. It is a cluster scoped object by people. And this isn't even bringing into the difficulties in terms of RBAC with respect to accessing the resources defined by it, right? Like there's a lot of extending the API server machinery to meet custom use cases is still very, very complicated. And like the only thing we've seen people be successful with using Helm in conjunction with this is the administrator flow for creating custom resources is still separate from what you're putting inside the Helm chart. And the Helm chart depends only on the custom resources themselves, right? So well, go ahead.
Yeah, and some of this, of course, is custom resources are still all alpha, right? And so
no, beta.
That's not
beta now.
Oh, it's been beta. Yeah.
So everything's still in work and in flux, and so yeah, that's what I'm trying to also figure out is what's what are the good guidance here? Because people are already doing this stuff upstream and how they want to share things and tell people to install their applications. And they all need general guidance right now. So it's also for tool authors, people who are sharing their applications with each other because they're building third-party applications to install on everyone's clusters. We probably need a good place to come up with what are the practices, make sure API machinery and everyone is good with the guidance for them, and then document them and share that out.
Yeah. Honestly, I think the simple guidance is you don't use CRDs unless you own the cluster or you distribute the cluster, because in any other way, you are elevating privileges. Like if Helm is granted privileges to create customer source definitions, it means any user can do that, and you are bumping into the multi-tenancy issues that would have been prevented by the RBAC setting up properly.
Well, yeah, part of it though is people are doing this today, and we have to not just say this is how they should do things, because they're doing something differently.
I've been talking about this with API machinery mainly to actually get those namespace CRDs, but the state right now, people are misusing CRDs for cases when they just want structured config for their application. It's not extending the cluster. They are basically making structured up with something that makes you, that forces you to be cluster admin, which is wrong. But yeah.
And not only do you have to be able to have administrative privileges, so you have to be able to create cluster scoped objects, in particular CRDs, but the power to do that is useful without having elevated privileges to control RBAC rules to grant access to those CRDs, which means either being able to create cluster role bindings or role bindings. And generally for role bindings, you have to do it on a per namespace basis, which means you probably also have to be able to create the principles that are associated with those. So it's really like the entire thing works if the only person who's installing CRDs is a cluster administrator, and that's the only thing that really works right now.
Yeah, we need to talk more about this. I'm guessing we need to take this over to SIG API machinery as the next step. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I mean, like this is something that's already kind of being discussed in API machinery as well as SIG architecture. So it's not like we'd be starting a new conversation. But for people who are interested in the direction that this heads and trying to shape it, participating in the conversation would be something you'd want to do like soonish, real soon.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we can follow up and chase down folks in SIG API machinery and the SIG architecture space to talk about this. If there's anybody else interested in these problems, let me know. But CRDs are being massively used in the wild for lots of different use cases, and it's become an app problem because lots of apps are using this. And so if we want something different out of them, we need to give them guidance, and we need to hear their use cases, because this is just kind of how they're doing things. In fact, there were even talks at KubeCon about how to do this. So we need to jump on.
There are talks about how to do this, and the largest people that have problems with this are running it on bare metal, and they are using namespaces. They're trying to run largest clusters using namespace tenancy, right? And they want individual teams to have these permissions, and that becomes a nightmare for them for the most part. But the way that this gets approached and the problem that we need to solve isn't necessarily 100% clear. But yeah, I mean, we should get more people involved in the conversation for sure. Make sure other people's viewpoints get heard on this.
So let me suggest this. If you're interested in this conversation, SIG architecture on Thursday, right after the community meeting at 11 a.m. Pacific time, is slated to talk about this. And so I would suggest coming to that meeting if you're interested in it, and giving your ideas. We'll figure out how we engage with SIG API machinery, if we should, or if we should start at SIG architecture in the meantime. If we should get this involved in SIG API machinery, we'll fire something off to the SIG Apps mailing list just to let folks know. That's probably the next steps. Does that sound good? I'll take silence as acceptance. We are 3 minutes over. Thanks you everyone for coming, and we'll continue our fun-filled conversations next week. Thanks everyone.